last night, overnight, when they saw a window to give the green light and go ahead with these remarkable, remarkable developments. Hallie.
And any clarity, Monica, on how that unfolded? Injuries, for example, the president suggested, I believe, that a helicopter, or at least an aircraft, was hit but flyable, as he put it, in the process of what he called what the defense secretary called exfiltration, which is getting out of Venezuela.
Yeah, we are learning that there were several injuries to U.S. service members here. I'm told by a White House official that they are all in stable and good condition. We are trying to learn more about how many that means, what kinds of injuries, but it does seem it could be related to that helicopter incident that you've referenced, the president mentioning in that news conference. They also specifically spoke to the fact that clearly no U.S. service members were killed, thank goodness, but that also no U.S. equipment was, quote, lost. So while there may have been some damage, as you mentioned there, to some of the aircraft, it's unclear exactly the extent of that. And again, I think in raising this, we also have to ask about what the president didn't rule out and effectively leaned into in that news conference, which is the idea that there could be U.S. boots on the ground in who knows for how long a capacity in Venezuela now with this current operation, with the fact that the president's saying that we shouldn't be, quote, afraid of boots on the ground, saying that that's something that the U.S. can handle, but giving absolutely no indication how many, how long, and when or whether there will be an end date to that as we talk about the fate of the U.S. service members who were involved in the operation last night and the fate of these potential U.S. service members who could be involved in this prolonged entanglement for some long time to come. Hallie.
Monica Alba live for us there just outside the White House. And Mom, before I let you go, I just want to make a note. If our audience can hear some of the audio behind you, and I think we still have Monica, there are typically protests that are at the sort of out front of the White House at the plaza. It's maybe a block from where the White House sits. Are those related today, Monica, to Venezuela? Are you seeing a gathering crowd here in Washington?
It certainly sounds like it, Hallie, from what I can make out, and this is a growing crowd. This is Lafayette Park, and right in front of it, right in front of the White House, where the public is at times allowed to gather. Sometimes it's shut down for security purposes, but we have been hearing some chants of things like hands off Venezuela, effectively hearing that growing. I think more people are coming to join that with that kind of a message for the president, who, we can remind everybody, is not currently here in Washington. He is still down in Florida until he is set to return tomorrow evening.
Monica Alba, watching it all. Mon, thank you very much. I want to go now to Keir Simmons, back to Keir, because Keir, one of the people Monica mentioned is potentially an important player here, obviously, Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader of Venezuela, fresh off of her Nobel Peace Prize acceptance in Norway. Unclear where she is now, but she has put some communication out already, right, suggesting that the people of Venezuela will hear more from her about essentially the next steps, a direction, if you will, from her. Tell us more about who she is and what else we know.
Well, she's been committed to democracy for a long time, and as you say, she won the Nobel Peace Prize for that ambition. And we've been reporting on these strikes since the early hours of this morning, and it did take some time for her to be to make that statement, but I think that she has been under U.S. protection, and clearly one of the ambitions has been to make sure that she is safe, and that's been an ambition over a sustained period, because there's been a risk to her from the Venezuelan regime, from the Maduro regime, of course. It has been a threat to them. A question of whether or not, Hallie, she now becomes well, clearly she is crucial to the future of Venezuela, but what role she plays is a different one, because of what we heard President Trump say about Delcy Rodriguez in that news conference, and the fact that Secretary Rubio had a conversation with Delcy Rodriguez, according to President Trump, in which Rodriguez, and remember, Rodriguez being the former vice president, well, still, I guess, the vice president, maybe now the acting president under Maduro. So Rodriguez appears to be the person, just referencing what President Trump himself seemed to say in that news conference. She seems to be the person that the U.S. is talking to at this stage. But listen, we have to just really remind folks, and it bears saying again and again, that we are just hours from the regime change. That regime change just occurred in Venezuela. was removed. That's happened just hours ago. We know from our experience of these things, of U.S. intervention in other places, that there is exuberance, and celebration initially, but that then the hard work begins in terms of how a country should be run, how to replace a regime. And now, has the Trump administration, if you like, learned from Iraq? And is it trying to not simply remove the entire government infrastructure from Venezuela, but is it trying to instead bring about change, but through that infrastructure, persuade those people, the nuts and bolts of Venezuela, if you like, that they should change sides? That is, I think, an interesting question. But many who know Venezuela well will tell you, Hallie, that these are not solid government machines, that not the government itself nor the opposition. They are weak, and there are multiple factions and leaders within Venezuela, and without going into the detail, inevitably that sets up the risk that there is a battle for power, and in some countries what you see is civil war. We're not there yet. Again, we are just hours from when this strike happened, and the regime change happened, and we're going to have to see what happens in days and weeks and even months ahead.
But already, Keir, the president has fired at least verbal warning shots to some other leaders in the region. You think of the head of Colombia, for example. There's even a reference to Mexico there as it related to specifically drug trafficking, which has long obviously frustrated the president. It's been a priority of his. If you are sitting in Colombia right now, if you're Petra, how seriously are you taking those warnings where the president suggests that he better essentially watch himself after what happened to Maduro?
Oh, I think you're taking it seriously. No question. I mean, that is, I think, unquestionably one of the impacts of 2025 under President Trump, and now, of course, 2026, is that capitals, leaders are listening. Secretary Rubio said it, didn't he, in that news conference? Message to the world, to the many around the world who like to play games. He didn't say which countries he was referring to or which leaders he was referring to. But I've said already a number of times, Hallie, on our air through today that, for example, the Iranians in Tehran, they had a close alliance with Maduro and with the Maduro regime in Venezuela, and they are facing the most significant protests in years in Iran, and they've been told by the Trump administration, if you attack those protesters, we will target you. Now, if you're the supreme leader in Iran right now, you are inevitably saying to yourself, well, hold on, the US is prepared to remove the leader of a sovereign state. What does that mean for me? How far is the Trump administration prepared to go? And it's not just Iran, as you mentioned, a number of countries in Latin America may be worrying in a similar way. Certainly, all around the world, there are questions. And while Iran is worrying, China will be watching. And I think that the question of how, keep in mind, China is a naturally very, very cautious government in many ways. And how Beijing is viewing this will be something that people will be picking over. Whether it says to them, just be careful, because actually you never know what the Trump administration is going to do, or whether they conclude from this, actually, this is a green light for countries to intervene in their own regions, and that's the new world we live in. I mean, these things, we're going to have to wait.
Keir Simmons, Keir, we're glad to have you with us today. Thank you. I know you'll stay close to your camera, but as you hear Keir talk about this warning that was delivered not just by Secretary of State Marco Rubio to other leaders, but by President Trump himself to the region, around the world, I want to play you a little bit of that. Here it is.
All political and military figures in Venezuela should understand what happened to Maduro can happen to them, and it will happen to them if they aren't just fair, even to their people. The dictator and terrorist, Maduro, is finally gone in Venezuela. People are free. They're free again. It's been a long time for them, but they're free.
I want to bring in now Brian Fonseca, director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University. Brian, thank you so much for being with us and for your patience as we've been in this rolling coverage after these significant developments today.
No, thanks so much for having me.
Let's talk about this warning from President Trump to other leaders and the reaction inside Venezuela. As you have watched this play out, what are your biggest questions moving forward?
I mean, the most important question is what happens next. You heard the president sort of allude to the fact that the United States was going to run Venezuela. I suggest, I think what the president's suggesting there is that the United States is going to exercise incredible influence through its economic sectors as a means of putting pressure on the political, bodies and processes that are going to unfold in Venezuela in the coming, days, weeks, and months. And I think that's what he's suggesting. I think the warning he gave to other leaders is probably targeted particularly at Diaz-Canel in Cuba, Ortega in Nicaragua, as two countries that the United States and certainly Secretary Marco Rubio has his eyes set on affecting some form of change away from dictatorship or autocracies back to democracy, especially in the context of the Western Hemisphere being a priority in American national security thinking right now.
The other piece of this, too, is the leadership in Venezuela moving forward. That's critical to this. And we've talked about how the president has suggested there will be, obviously, American leadership and involvement. He didn't put a timeline on it. He said until there is some kind of a safe transition, but when pressed about that, suggested he would not support new elections in Venezuela, democratic elections in Venezuela, unless and until the oil infrastructure is rebuilt by the United States. And so I think we're looking at a potentially significant period of time. When you hear about Delcy Rodriguez, when the president and the Secretary of State invoke her, of course, the vice president who's been sworn in now as president, Secretary of State Rubio having what was described as a lengthy conversation with her. Help us understand what her role could be in any kind of Venezuelan American leadership moving forward for that country.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's brought in to sort of serve as an arbitrator or a broker of transition. I mean, ultimately, the institutions that matter in Venezuela don't have a whole lot of trust for the democratic opposition that has been sort of in the streets over the last several months, and particularly, people, figures like Maria Machado. And so those institutions, and I'm talking about institutions like the Venezuelan military and Venezuelan security forces, I think those institutions don't trust the opposition. And I think those institutions are critical in any type of transition back to Venezuela in the future. I think what the president may be suggesting there is that Delcy and some other co-power or power sharing structure is going to be in place until there's a time in which new elections will be called. And I suspect you could look as far as 18 months out before new elections are called. And then the country has an opportunity to democratically elect its next leader. Until then, it's going to be a power sharing structure that includes Delcy as sort of the head of state, and then U.S. and opposition members sort of in that mix in terms of governing, purging institutions, bringing those institutions back into the rules of the democratic game. And that will sort of maintain until elections are called and again, some type of formal transition back to democracy follows.
And how do you see the role of the United States as almost a kind of, as the president described it, oil broker in Venezuela if and when that infrastructure is rebuilt, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the oil sector in Venezuela is the most important economic engine for Venezuela. It's been that way historically. Venezuela has been sitting on, an enormous amount of oil for a very long time. One of the founding members of OPEC in 1960. And yes, the U.S. has been deeply involved in building out Venezuela's energy infrastructure for over a century now. And so Venezuela is one of the big players in oil. And I think the United States is looking to take a dominant position in the Venezuelan oil sector and leverage that position as a means of affecting political influence in Venezuela while also benefiting economically in Venezuela and for the United States as it brokers that sort of reintroduction of Venezuelan oil into the global oil market.
Before we let you go, I just want to get a sense for you, not just on what's next, but also how you have seen this unfold, because I just have been speaking with an expert, former SDNY prosecutor. Of course, the indictment against Maduro is out of the Southern District of New York, who suggested that based on the reading of this indictment, for somebody this high profile, for somebody in the position of power that Nicolas Maduro has been in, it is likely there were cooperators, insiders, in other words, who were having some kind of a back channel communication with United States officials here. And I wonder, as somebody who's watched this region, who's an expert here and who knows this well, if that sounds credible to you. Like I said, it seems likely, but give us your sense of that.
Yeah, no, I think it absolutely sounds credible. I mean, I won't say entire ease, right? I mean, this was a very difficult, complex military operation that unfolded. It was a multi-domain operation that included air, sea, land. And so all those elements, are really sophisticated and complex to pull off. And the fact that the United States was able to go in with relative ease and extract, Maduro in the cover of night, I think there has to be some degree of, engagement that took place in the lead up to that. Just the location of where he was at and the ability to, again, target and get in and out relatively easily, I think it, suggests that there may have been a little bit more to uncover in terms of the, complicitness of other important actors on the ground. And I think, again, this was all about timing. If members of the political or military elite jumped too early and the regime didn't fall, then those people were probably going to end up in prison, if not worse, by, being convicted or prosecuted by the current regime. And I think timing was really critical to all of this. This has been a buildup, by the way, that's been, 6 months in the making, at least in terms of the ability. Once the United States decided it was going to start introducing military assets into the region, I think this was always one of the objectives, was to remove Maduro from power and see some form of valley or transition period back to democracy for Venezuela. As an important country in this hemisphere, not just in the context of, democratic governance, but also in the context of, harboring American adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran, and giving them space to operate in the Western Hemisphere.
Brian Fonseca, thank you so much for your expertise and for joining us during our coverage here on NBC News. Appreciate that. I want to take it back here to Washington and specifically to the building a couple of blocks from where I'm sitting, and that's the United States Capitol. Mel Zanona is there, our congressional correspondent, and while members of Congress are out for the tail end now of this holiday recess, essentially, Mel, their holiday breaks, there has been a lot of reaction from the left, but also from inside the president's own party about what has developed in Venezuela. I know we expect to hear from at least one senator coming up in the next 20 minutes or so, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're expecting to hear from Tim Kaine. That is the Democrat from Virginia. He's expecting to introduce a resolution and force a floor vote as soon as next week that would essentially block additional action in Venezuela without congressional approval. That has been a key part of this debate on Capitol Hill. But similar measures have failed in the past because there's actually very few Republicans who have sided with that idea. For the most part, what we have seen from Republicans is overwhelming support for Trump's actions and the capture of Maduro. And in fact, there were a number of administration officials, including Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hegseth, who have been calling members all morning, all day today, sort of walking them through their justification for this action, which did not receive any authorization from Congress. And in fact, Congress was not even notified prior to these actions taking place, with Secretary Rubio saying this is not the kind of mission you can pre-notify Congress, that it would endanger the operation, endanger the mission. And then President Trump at the press conference stepped in and said Congress tends to leak. We don't want leakers, suggesting that is the reason that they didn't share this very sensitive information with top members of leadership as well as top members of the Intelligence Committee. But the argument that has been made to Republican lawmakers, and it seems to have worked with at least one skeptic, that's Mike Lee of Utah, is that the reason why they didn't need authorization in this case is because they were carrying out a warrant to arrest Maduro. And so any action with the military, any strikes were intended to protect U.S. military personnel, which Republicans, including Mike Lee, argues completely falls within Trump's constitutional jurisdiction. Now, that being said, there have been a few Republicans who have come out and said that they disagree with what Trump did here. They think it's unconstitutional. That includes Thomas Massie. And then I think really notable for me, Holly, was Marjorie Taylor Greene, a former Trump ally who was noticeably split with the president in recent weeks and months. She came out and said, MAGA voted to end forever wars. Boy, were we wrong when we voted for Trump, thinking that this would not happen. And so while there are a few Republicans who are voicing their criticism, by and large, Republicans are standing by them. Democrats, of course, that's a separate question. Like I said, we'll see that war powers vote next week. The question
Lou, you
is
need
whether
me?
more Republicans will actually join that
How
effort.
are to all
So
these-
far, though, Hallie, it does not look like that's the case.
Mel
Lou,
Zanona
do you
live
need
for
me?
us on Capitol Hill. Mel, thank you. And I want to share some breaking news just into
I
our
need y'all to hit
newsroom
the
from our
like button.
colleagues, Jonathan Dienst and Tom Winter here, that multiple officials briefed on the matter say that Nicolas Maduro is, as we speak, and we knew this, en route back from the Caribbean or from the Caribbean to the United States. He is scheduled to travel to a New York area airport and then be helicoptered to a location in New York City These officials say he will be processed and then ultimately transported to a jail facility. So as we speak, according to multiple officials talking with NBC News, Nicolas Maduro is on his way to the United States, where he will be booked and then put behind bars, set to face a sweeping indictment, a series of charges from the Southern District of New York related to alleged narco-terrorism and drug trafficking. I want to bring in now our senior national security correspondent,
352 is in the chat.
These developments are moving forward, Courtney, presumably as expected on the part of the Trump administration. And as we heard from officials inside the Trump administration, too, a mission that was not without risk, that was not without peril. And I know you have some new reporting on that front, too.
Yeah, that's right. So one thing that we didn't get an answer to in that extensive press conference from the president, and then the quite a bit of military detail from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, was whether there were any Americans injured. We are now learning that, in fact, there were several American service members who were injured during the course of this operation. They are all in stable condition at this point. But what's really critical here is when officials were talking about there not being any casualties. With the military, a casualty refers to both individuals who were killed or injured. So very critically, there were several who were injured. Now, we also heard from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs during his rundown of what occurred there that there was a U.S. military helicopter that was also damaged during the course of this. There was a gun battle, according to the way that the chairman explained it here, as the U.S., specifically as the U.S. was trying to extract Maduro and his wife out of their compound. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs explaining that the U.S. responded with overwhelming firepower back at whatever the incoming was, and that, again, there was at least one helicopter that was damaged. It was not completely destroyed. It was able to fly back, but now also learning that, in fact, there were several Americans who were injured during the course of this operation, Hallie.
We also heard a remarkable level of detail from President Trump, Courtney, and we have seen this from him in the past when describing military operations, about the way that this process unfolded, including this implication, Court, that the United States had some kind of role in basically blacking out Caracas when this mission was undertaken.
That really raised my eyebrows, too, because we don't normally hear about this sort of thing. I mean, and there's several different ways. The reality is we know that the U.S. and the U.S. military specifically have these sorts of capabilities. So they have the ability to jam radars and to jam air defense systems to essentially create, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs explained it, a pathway for this mission that was going in on the ground there. What they want to do is create conditions so it's as safe as possible for the team that's going in to actually grab Nicolas Maduro and his wife, so that they have taken out as many of the possible threats as possible. Now, one way we've seen this with manned aircraft in the past with U.S. military missions, where they will jam the air defenses, but we also know they have the ability through cyber and other means to essentially black out locations. And the president indicating that the U.S. did that. He didn't give them the means in which that happened, but he did say the U.S. did it. Remember, the U.S. also had a number of different aircraft that they've been flowing into the region in recent weeks that have similar capabilities. They have the jammers, they have the F-35s that has the ability, again, to create a jam, electronic warfare capabilities. So any one of those, or frankly all of those, could have been used in this case.
The other piece of this, too, Courtney, is the potential of, as you have talked about here and as we've talked about in our coverage, of boots on the ground, U.S. boots on the ground in Venezuela. The president, we know this from having covered the president for a long time, never likes to rule anything in or out. You'll very rarely hear him take something off the table. He did not, in this case, take that off the table, but he went a step further and he said something along the lines of, people are afraid of the phrase, afraid of putting boots on the ground. He said, I don't think we need to be afraid of that, essentially. Help us understand what that might actually look like. Obviously, there is already an American military presence that is in the Caribbean. We know that that's been ramped up over the course of the last 5 or 6 months. These troops would be there to, secure oil that the United States would then have a hand in?
So remember, he didn't just talk about boots on the ground, but he said that he didn't rule out, and he even threatened the possibility of a second wave or additional strikes by the U.S. military. He even said that if, in fact, the U.S. were to carry those out, they would be bigger, larger strikes and potentially more targets. I mean, that really, it begs the question of what additional targets the U.S. would need to go after if, in fact, this transition period is going to play out the way that the president explained it, with U.S. senior U.S. national security officials in the Trump administration playing a serious major role in actually running the country. But remember what else President Trump has talked about just in recent months, and that is the possibility, officials have talked about the possibility of using the U.S. military to secure locations like potentially critical minerals in Ukraine. Not something that's obviously come to pass, but something that has been discussed in the past. Also protecting other critical infrastructure in other locations. So the fact that the president so emphasized the oil and gas in Venezuela as being a part of the motivation here, you know, talking about the potential for boots on the ground to provide some sort of security, it wouldn't surprise me if that was part of the conversations. No one is telling us that directly, but based on what he said today, it wouldn't surprise me if that was part of the conversations, Hallie.
Courtney Kube, that's super interesting, and we're glad to have you and your expertise, as I know you're continuing to make phone calls, as you have been doing now for the better part of almost coming up, I think, 12 hours. Court, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Let me go now to George Solis, who is live for us in South Florida. And George, I think we have you. I know it's a little bit loud where you are. We have spoken with Jesse Kirsch. We've spoken with you. I know that you're in the thick of it there, as you have Venezuelans gathering now, many of them celebrating the removal of Nicolas Maduro.
Yeah, exactly right, Hallie. We're in Doral, Florida, affectionately known as Dorozuela. This right to the gathering center outside Arepaso. Crowds have been coming and going. This party showing no signs of slowing down. Every so often, the music will pick up. You'll hear horns honking, people in support, the flags of Venezuela flying here across the crowd. Moments ago, the crowd chanting in Spanish, the government is over, the government has fallen. That's, again, just a number of chants that we have been hearing about freedom, liberty. I have been to this area numerous times while we've been covering the story of Venezuela, Hallie, and so many people in this community say we have not felt comfortable to step out to speak, many of them not wanting to show their faces out of fear of concern for their families in Venezuela. Today, a much different story, as so many have gathered here in this community ready to share their excitement. They've told me they have spoken to their family members in Caracas, some of them saying right now, some of those family members are still getting word of what happened. Some of them saying they are still celebrating privately in their home. Many of them hoping to be able to get to gatherings on the streets like this, but that it's just not the time for them. Many of them reacting, of course, to what they say is a regime that has been oppressive. Many of them waiting decades for a change, for freedom in Venezuela. And again, the party here not showing any signs of slowing down. This crowd has only been growing hour by hour. Some of them getting here as early as 3, 4 o'clock this morning as word started to trickle down here. And I've been checking around other businesses in this community. There are just small gatherings and celebrations as far as you can imagine. Again, Doral here, one of the largest populations of Venezuelans in the U.S. And of course, they are making their mark and their voices heard here today, Hallie. Again, you can see more of the flags here in the distance. Police here also a heavy presence. They are making sure everything here stays orderly, and for the most part, I can say that it has been. And you're seeing some leadership here from Miami and some other council members also arriving here to take part in this celebration. Again, just a collective energy here is only increasing as the hours go by.
And George, I know that you had a chance to talk with some of these folks who relayed some of those conversations. When you talk about having been in this location previously, and obviously we've been covering the escalating tensions in Venezuela for months now, give us a sense of how different this moment feels than the others you've been there for.
Yes, I'm just going to step a little bit closer to get away from some of the noise, but the energy is completely different, Hallie. I mean, I got to tell you, we have talked to mothers, to fathers here, asking them to give us a sense of what they were thinking as they saw some of those boat strikes. Some of them saying, we've seen some of these playbooks, we've seen some of this play out before, but truthfully, we don't know if we can trust that this is really going to lead to a regime change. They were waiting, holding their breath, a lot of cautious optimism, a lot of them excited when the opposition leader was in Oslo receiving her Nobel Peace Prize. Many saying they wanted Corina Machado to be back in Venezuela. They were hoping that this was all just sort of setting the stage, if you will, for something much larger. And again, now that I'm talking to some of these same people and hearing from some of these voices, many of them not afraid to show their faces, many of them eager to restore their businesses and open their doors and just welcome a change in regime, a change in leadership. Many excited for what's next. Some of them telling me they're thinking about their plans to return home to see family they haven't seen in years. Some of them still saying not quite yet, that there's still that cautious optimism, as I mentioned. But again, Hallie, as you hear the sounds here, the echoes of this crowd, there's definitely a sense that, again, the excitement here, again, it's just going to carry on into the night here.
A lot of enthusiasm, a lot of activity there in Doral. George Solis, thank you very much for being out there. I know you'll remain out there through the better part of the afternoon as we get more developments. Obviously, on Nicolas Maduro being transported now to the United States after that attack on Venezuela, and the military helping to bring Maduro into custody, then transported to a U.S. Ship, essentially, and now heading to New York. I want to bring in Professor Alan Weiner, Director of the Program of International Law at Stanford Law School. Professor, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure to be with you.
And let me start with Maduro being taken into custody here. And there have been questions raised around the legality of the United States making a move like that, setting aside, of course, the indictment or considering the indictment for the Southern District of New York. What is your assessment, Professor, of the legality of what the United States has undertaken here?
Well, two separate questions. One is it lawful for the United States to indict Maduro for violating provisions of U.S. law? And I think that's not controversial. The bigger question is, are we allowed to basically invade other countries in order to capture people who have been indicted under U.S. law? And I think the answer to that is quite clearly no. This is unquestionably a use of force. And the UN Charter, to which the United States, of course, is a party. In fact, the United States was the leading architect of the United Nations Charter, prohibits states from using force in their international relations against one another, except in self-defense. And there's, I think, no plausible claim here that the United States had a self-defense justification for invading Venezuela.
And I want to put a fine point on that. What has happened is not extradition, Professor, right?
No, extradition would be done pursuant to a treaty, and it would run through the, you'd submit an indictment, and the other country would have a chance to review it. That would be a formal legal process. Now, this is an abduction.
And those kinds of legal processes play out all the time, right? I mean, we see extraditions all the time in the United States. We rarely see, obviously, large-scale military operations to take down the leader of another country like this.
Extradition is the normal way that we obtain jurisdiction over a fugitive in a foreign country. Now, no one expects.
Now, it would be funny if Letitia James now don't find a probable evidence or just cause to charge it.
No, I mean you're totally right.
Oh, that would be funny
if they
about
the international pushback
refuse
here,
to charge him and let him go.
Any of that kind of pushback?
Being spiteful like Trump would be.
I always tell people, international law is very different from the way that a domestic legal system that's a
y'all please double tap the face of y'all screen and get the lights up, please.
Necessarily to resolve disputes. There's no international police force. Now, countries like the United States like this. The reason why the international system is structured the way that it is because we want states to have discretion and sovereignty. It is the case that Venezuela, and this may come as a surprise, is a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So it is conceivable that we will see an investigation in the ICC.
Now he wants the people that he was trying to prosecute him so that he could steal their all.
Enforce international law is through self-help, through reciprocal measures. Think about the way the international community has responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with sanctions and isolating Russia from international organizations. The United States has the advantage of being the most powerful country in the world, which enables it to resist that. The question we have to ask is, do we want to live in a world where powerful countries can invade their weaker neighbors?
Right.
If that's the norm, and that's what the world was like through the 17th and 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries. If that's the norm, we're going to face a global system in which aggression, warfare, military intervention is common. That's why we supported the UN Charter and the idea that states should not be able to invade their neighbors to pursue their foreign policy objectives, as the United States has done here.
Professor, the president, as you well know, has justified this action, and we heard this from his top cabinet officials as well, by saying that this was a necessary measure in order to protect United States national security. They have made this an argument about the protection of assets and interests here at home domestically.
No, you want
Does that argument hold up in an international court of law?
I don't think it's an argument because it's a claim because there's no evidence to support it.
Right.
I mean, I spent some time this morning looking
at
the indictment that has been released against Maduro. Of course, what was the justification for the attacks against the drug boats, which were the precursor to this? Oh my God, the fentanyl crisis causing many deaths
but you let
in the United
Honduras
States. The fentanyl crisis is a serious one. If you review the indictment that's been issued, the word fentanyl does not appear once in the indictment that's been issued against Maduro. So no, these are not, the fact that you don't like a country, the fact that you have difficult foreign policy relations, the fact that it might be doing things that are harmful to you are not justifications for invading the country and overthrowing them. The law is clear. You can use force against another country only if you have sustained an armed attack.
Absolutely,
in
and we
self-defense, and that manifestly is not the case here.
He out of order. The issue of Venezuela's sovereign oil. In other words, another nation like the United States, and the president has suggested that the U.S. would go in, would rebuild oil infrastructure, would then, it sounds like, almost become a broker for Venezuelan oil. He was asked about, for example, obviously China is a huge buyer of the majority of Venezuelan oil, how that process would unfold. How does that fit into this bigger legal picture here?
It fits poorly, I'm afraid. If the United States puts boots on the ground and takes control,
it's dictatorship. You're trying to run it. You're trying to own it.
We would at that point be an occupying power. And the law is quite clear that when you're an occupying power, that does not give you the right to basically come in and take the assets of another country, to restructure the governance of another structure. You're there basically on a short-term basis to allow a new government to be reinstated and to take control of the country. The idea of taking control of this oil probably runs afoul of an old-standing prohibition in the law of armed conflict that makes it unlawful to engage in pillage. There's another old concept that says when you occupy another country, you act as a usufruct. It's an old legal term from the early 20th century, but basically it means you're a trustee. You're able to kind of manage these assets for the benefit of the people, not for the benefits of the invading or occupying force.
Professor, thank you so much for being with us and for bringing us your legal expertise at this critical moment, obviously, in American foreign policy. Appreciate your time. On that note, I want to bring in, our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. And Laura, I think there's an important distinction that we want to make here. And my conversations that I've had today with folks who are periphery to the legal piece of this, the SDNY indictment, so that's that sweeping indictment that you have been talking about on the air. It is my understanding, and help us work through this here, that it would certainly be, as Nicolas Maduro, as we speak right now, is on his way, based on multiple officials and the reporting of our colleague Tom Winter, on his way to the United States, to New York, where he will be booked and processed and put behind bars. It would be within his legal right to challenge the way that he was brought into custody in order to face this indictment, Laura, but that is separate and apart from the charges listed in this indictment. In other words, the method of his, let's call it arrest, separate from the process legally that would unfold in the SDNY.
And I think that's a really helpful distinction to make, Hallie, because especially at the press conference, all of the focus on oil and the interest that the United States might have in the Maduro regime, so to speak, is entirely separate from the substance of what line prosecutors in the Southern District of New York are going to be facing come Monday when they have to go into court and defend these actions, right? And so the substance of the drug and the gun running, that might all be completely legit, and prosecutors may point to the fact that this was brought years ago, and there's some changes here and there, but mostly the same. The situation that is far different than 2020 is the way that he was extracted and the stunning nature that we saw a sovereign power essentially removed in a non-voluntary fashion. And that's where a defense attorney, maybe to some success, maybe not, could try to find some area to exploit, right? If you can't go after the actual charges, you go after the way the person was apprehended, Hallie. And I think that's the thing that you're going to see play out in the short term.
So play that out, because in the short term, could that not ultimately mean that at some point in the relatively near-ish future, you would have a sitting federal judge needing to make a determination on whether this massive military action taken to remove Maduro from Venezuela was legal or not?
Yes, and that's sort of where this could be headed, Hallie, especially if he manages to have an effective defense attorney who mounts that type of argument and finds a judge that finds this problematic in some way, which, again, you can imagine the sort of response that that's going to receive from this Justice Department and this president. Already, we've seen so many different sort of conflicts, if you will, over executive power and the way that this president has wielded a very expansive view. And we've seen clashes with any number of different federal judges